Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk once again. As they say, once bitten, twice shy, so another round of apologies for yesterday. What I'm going to talk today is about the statistical issues involved in observational studies, registries, and again, shift the focus mainly to coming back to meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials, which we touched upon yesterday. Now, just by a show of hands, can I just ask the audience, who amongst the audience is known to do statistical work or was a statistician amongst you? So Peter is, Peter, just be kind with your questions then. So, well, this is not a talk which is primarily related to individual substances or individual trials. So, but still, I think there are a couple of conflicts of interest which I should probably disclose, which are mainly intellectual. The first thing which I would like to point out is I'm primarily a clinician and an epidemiologist. And unfortunately, the fact is that I will be talking to you about statistics on a Saturday morning. So please bear with me if some of the concepts sound very basic, some of them sound too exotic, and some of them don't quite make any sense, but it will all tie together at the very end of the whole story. So the way I thought I should probably lay out my talk is to briefly go through some of the key issues that are involved in observational studies. What are the analytical or statistical issues that affect the way we look at data, that affect the way we interpret the findings of observational studies, and then sort of extend that paradigm into the analysis of randomized controlled trials, especially in the context of meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials. And finally, I will try to finish off by showing you at least one slide about what is emerging in the field of meta-analyses of RCTs, which has got a huge bearing nowadays on regulatory issues. So coming to the observational studies and how we go about analyzing observational databases, one of the central tenets of epidemiology is this curious relationship between a given exposure and an outcome. Say, for example, there's a general belief in epidemiological parlance that we start off, all of us, developing certain risk factors for cardiovascular disease as we age. And that might lead to some intermediate phenotypes, which I will show you as an example in just a moment. And finally, through those intermediate phenotypes, there are hard clinical endpoints like acute heart attacks, strokes, deaths, so on and so forth. So if you take the example of raised cholesterol levels, now most of us are very familiar with almost all of us are familiar with the fact that hypercholesterolemia can lead to atherosclerosis, which is the classical intermediate phenotype. And eventually that can lead to a very hard clinical endpoint like coronary artery disease. Now, this fundamental tenet applies to almost all types of epidemiological work, analyses, and interpretation of the data. And that also equally extends and applies to clinical trials. And I'll show you why. Take the example of diabetes, atherosclerosis, and CAD. That also fits within the paradigm of the risk factors or the exposures leading on to disease outcomes. Now, in the clinical trial context, what we are mostly interested in is whether by modifying the risk of this particular exposure, we see any decrease in a given outcome. So that's how this paradigm of exposures and outcomes is equally applicable to clinical trials or RCTs, but in the context of protection rather than increasing the risk of a particular disease or an outcome. Now, unfortunately, we don't live in an ideal world. So especially in the context of observational studies, there are plenty of deviations or causes for deviation from the truth. And what are they? We will explore one by one. Now, let's revisit this paradigm of exposure leading to a given outcome. Now, the conventional definition is if the relationship is true between the exposure and outcome, the relationship should hold true regardless of how many number of times we repeat the experiment. But there are what are called as confounders, which are associated equally with the exposure as well as with the outcome, that can confuse this relationship. And therefore, accounting for confounding, especially in the context of observational studies, is absolutely critical to the interpretation of our findings. This is less relevant in robustly conducted randomized controlled trials like the previous speaker alluded to, because that literally tends to knock out both known and unknown confounding. I'll give you a classic example here. Now, there was a belief previously that coffee drinking was associated with pancreatic cancer. Now, when people analyzed the data more robustly, they felt that smoking was the most important confounder in this relationship. So there was a belief that, at least in the studies that were analyzed, people who tended to drink more coffee were also smoking quite heavily, and therefore what appeared like a signal of harm for coffee drinking was actually caused by smoking rather than by coffee drinking per se. Now, I cannot give you a better example than this in terms of very large-scale observational studies, in terms of how confounding plays a role in the way we understand science and how we interpret what we think are well-known or well-established truths. This is perhaps the largest body of evidence on lipids from the emerging risk factors collaboration. Now, what these collaborators conducted was they pooled individual participant data on more than 300,000 participants from over 68 prospective collaborative studies around the world, predominantly based in Western populations. And as we might have read or believed in the past, most of us believe that triglyceride levels, which is one of the lipid fractions, is associated with an increased risk of coronary artery disease. Now, that is true as long as we don't take account of confounding here. So what these graphs nicely illustrate is that if we adjust for the confounding factors, you see how flat the relationship becomes. Whereas that is not the case if you look at non-HDL cholesterol, wherein despite accounting for multiple confounding factors, as is illustrated in these black boxes, the relationship still remains robust. So that led to a very paradigm shift in the way we look at lipids as potential causal factors in epidemiology. And therefore, as I said before, it is quite important that we consider what are the relevant confounders for a given association and try to adjust them. And again, I must emphasize, but because this is primarily a course or a seminar on randomized clinical trials, this may be less applicable, but perhaps there are some exceptions to that rule as well, especially when we're dealing with long-term follow-up data of clinical trials. So bias is something which none of us can really escape, because being humans, we have our own ways, whims and fancies of looking at data, designing studies, conducting studies. And of course, part of the bias cannot be avoided in large-scale international studies simply because there is too much variation around the world in different things. So if you were looking at observational data or registry data, one of the important things whenever we look at large pieces of or large volumes of data or large pieces of evidence on a given area of science is to be very critical to see whether some of the results can be potentially prone to bias or whether they are likely related to a chance phenomenon. Now, this is a part of my own work which this is all about trying to see whether there's any relationship or association between diabetes and glycemic risk factors and certain exotic outcomes like cancers. Now, most of us know that diabetes is a well-known risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So when we went around looking at very large bodies of evidence collated together across the world, we found initially a signal for harm for people having diabetes as well as raised levels of glycemic risk factors. There was a suggestion that there would be an increased risk of developing cancer and non-cancer, non-vascular outcomes. So when we looked at that signal in some more detail, lo and behold, we find that for a wide range of cancer outcomes, as has been illustrated on the left-hand panel here, we see that the association is increased, the risk is increased. Now, as I mentioned yesterday, whenever these horizontal bars fall well out of the null line, it means that the association is a statistically significant association. Now, one would argue that what would say for example, let us take the example of liver cancers here. There's a very high risk that has been reported in this particular analysis, almost a twofold excess risk of liver cancer in people with diabetes. Now, one can argue saying that because there is a well-known there's quite a lot of awareness amongst diabetologists or physicians about the occurrence of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, maybe people with diabetes were increasingly screened for any underlying liver conditions or liver fat. So that's an inherent source of a bias in those studies. So is it that which is driving such a strong relationship with liver cancer? On the other hand, for example, nobody would have thought that diabetes could potentially affect our esophagus. So therefore, is that the reason why the association with esophageal cancer is so non-significant? Well, the truth is we don't know what the real answers are unless we absolutely conduct a randomized controlled trial which is powered enough to study that treating diabetes or reducing these glycemic markers actually translates into reduction in the risk of these cancers. But that's just an example that I wanted to show. What about chance phenomenon? The previous speaker made an excellent allusion to the fact that whenever we do multiple testing, whether that is in the context of a trial or an observational study, we end up with a lot of errors, likely errors, simply because of random chance. So a very clever guy in early 1900s from Cambridge said that if there's a 1 in 20 chance that things could simply happen by chance. Now, I think if you apply the same principle, so going back to our cancer slide and coming back to this particular section of non-cancer and non-vascular deaths, one might simply argue that because we studied more than 20 outcomes in this list, a lot of them might simply be chance associations. So what is the guarantee that they are real associations? Again, these are things which can never be dealt with very reliably through statistics alone, and sometimes we will have to use our information about basics from basic science, clinical medicine, and other complementary tools to be able to rationalize the fact that yes, we do see a signal for harm or for benefit, but whether or not that is true is probably best dealt with a conglomerate of evidence rather than simply by a number or a statistic. Now, missing data is something which is a bane of registry-related work. I mean, I've worked on several registries myself, and one of the most frustrating features that I find for most registries is that a lot of information pieces are not collected. Very simple factors like even gender or age of the participants are missing in up to 5 or 10% of the participants, which is a big shame, because when we are so concerned about minimizing the scope of confounding or bias, one of the most important things that we would like to knock out from our statistical models is the sources of those bias or confounding. And unless we have all the pieces of information for all the individuals within a given study, we can never be able to do that reliably. So this is something which is particularly relevant to registry data. And coming from a clinical background, I think especially if in a very busy clinical environment, somebody tries to set up a small study, starts collecting data very opportunistically, that is one of the common things which I observe as a very haphazard approach to scientific research, wherein we end up with half-hearted information, half-baked stories, and perhaps dangerous clinical messages at the end of the day. Now, how do we deal with missing data? I think the most radical solution is to go back to the primary records and enrich the data source that we're working on to do our analysis on. But there are some clever statistical tools like multiple imputation, which can to some extent help us compensate for the fact that we have a significant proportion of missing data in our analysis data set. I will now move on to talking about the statistical issues involved in the conduct of meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials per se. Now, I will touch on several themes in this story, so forgive me if some of these themes are extremely relevant or you're very familiar with some of them. It is just for the sake of completion that I will do this. Now, what is the difference between a literature-based meta-analysis versus an individual participant data meta-analysis? When we publish randomized controlled trial evidence in public domain into scientific literature, it is perhaps the easiest way in which we can combine studies which have studied a similar scientific hypothesis to generate summary level estimates. And when we do that exercise, it by default would be a literature-based meta-analysis. Unfortunately, what a literature-based meta-analysis will only allow us to do is to deal with the summary estimates that are provided by individual studies. For example, in this particular case, we combined published literature only from around 9 studies which looked at the role of aspirin in primary prevention of cardiovascular disease. Now, primarily, the primary purpose of these clinical trials was to see what would be the effect of aspirin ranging from a dose of 75 milligrams a day up to 500 milligrams per day, depending on which country and which time period these studies were conducted in, to see what the effect of that on cardiovascular outcomes was. But when we actually did and drove these analyses, we were actually looking at something else as well. Now, if you remember, especially if you have been from this country, you might have remembered some stormy stories about the role of aspirin in cancer prevention, close to around 2010, between 2010 and 2012. So that was the phase when we got very excited about looking for any signal of benefit or otherwise for the role of aspirin used in the context of primary prevention, not secondary prevention, to prevent cancer outcomes. So what we tried to do is just simply summarize the available world's data through published literature and do a bit of simple basic arithmetic to get this particular, what we call as a composite forest plot. This is not a true forest plot per se, like for example this one where you have details of the individual trials, but these are outcomes, and this particular estimate is like the diamond that I showed you yesterday. It's like the diamond for this outcome for all 9 clinical trials combined. And based on this, what we concluded, if you look at the line for cancer mortality, this one, we found that the association was non-significant statistically. So although there was a suggestion that there might be a 7% protection or protective effect of use of aspirin in primary prevention against cancer mortality, overall, because it crossed the line of null, it was non-significant. But what happened was there were guys who were cleverer than us sitting in Oxford who had control on 51 randomized controlled trials from around the world, and not just summary estimates from those trials, but actually individual participant data. Now, as I mentioned before, what literature-based meta-analysis won't allow us to do is to actually deal with individual pieces of information, adjust consistently for confounding factors, and do detailed subgroup analyses, because we are only dealing with summary estimates and there are multiple assumptions that are involved in dealing with summary data. So what these guys, led by the team, Professor Peter Rothwell from Oxford, did was they actually summed up the evidence from around the world using individual participant data. And according to them, if you look at the story of aspirin and whether or not it prevents cancers, if you look at the first section of trials, the overall estimate was null association. There was no protective effect against cancers. If you look at the second chunk of analyses or studies, there was apparently almost a 25% protective effect against the development of cancers. Now, may I ask the audience, because this is a workshop, what difference do we see between the first sort of studies and the second lot of studies here? Absolutely, absolutely. So again, if I go back to the slide, there are 9 studies involved here, or maybe 8 studies for some outcomes, and then we have 51 studies, and of which they have tried to split most of these studies into based upon the duration of follow-up and other factors. Apart from that, I think the fundamental difference is if you have long-term follow-up data, you can factor that into your IPD meta-analysis, which unfortunately can never happen if you're dealing with published trial results from individual clinical trials. Now, there was quite a lot of controversy around whether the data that was published by the Oxford group was correct or the data that we published was correct. Even now, we don't quite know the answers because none of these individual trials asked primarily the question, can we prevent cancer if we give aspirin for primary prevention? So that only can be 100% answered if we do a bespoke clinical trial for that purpose. But short of doing that, the way we have interpreted the findings from Peter Rothwell's group was, if you look at the story more closely, there are some studies within that 51 bunch of studies that they abstracted IPD data on, which potentially involved secondary prevention trials as well. So we thought there was probably a mixed signal there. And if you look at, again, the split by the years of follow-up, that was different. And what the other fundamental difference, which I mentioned yesterday, which will be very pertinent in the context of cancers, is the fact that the way you define your outcome is absolutely important. Now, just going back one slide, if you look at this and read in between lines, we talked about cancer mortality. We never talked about incident cancers here. And that's the key difference. Whereas, if you look at the analysis from the aspirin collaboration, it is primarily a combination of both fatal and non-fatal cancers. And there can be a huge amount of difference between both. Now, our argument was, if somebody is given aspirin, there can be a potential detection bias whereby people might present earlier with a GI bleed simply because they are on aspirin, and that might actually be secondary to the fact that they might be harboring some GI polyps or some early forms of GI cancer. And the moment you actually pick it up, yes, you have registered an incident event of a cancer, but unfortunately, it doesn't actually translate into mortality benefits if it's already at a stage where it cannot be cured or resected. So these are some of the subtleties that all of us should bear in mind, especially when you're reading 2 parallel papers or 2 parallel pieces of work pertaining to the same hypothesis, especially in the context of meta-analyses of RCTs, but trying to give you 2 different or very slightly divergent opinions. So that's something that I'd wanted to emphasize to the audience. The other important methodological issue for consideration whenever we analyze trial data is whether we use a fixed effects model or a random effects model. What is the difference between the two? When we say we are using a fixed effect model, we simply believe, if you recall the exposure and outcome diagram that I showed earlier, you can replace the exposure with a drug and the outcome with a disease outcome in a given clinical trial or an RCT. So to sound very basic, I think a fixed effect model assumes that the effect of the exposure on the outcome or a drug on a given clinical outcome in an RCT is fundamentally the same regardless of in which population you study it. If there is any variation, it is likely only because of a random variation, nothing more. Now, whereas if you look at the random effects model, it assumes that fundamentally individual populations or study populations are going to be different no matter what you try to do to get rid of that difference. Of course, it's a boon if the statistical result turns out to be not showing any heterogeneity, but inherently the random effects model assumes that there is fundamental difference between studies, there is fundamental difference between the way you define your exposures or your outcomes, there's a fundamental difference between the way physicians analyze the occurrence of these outcomes, and there's a fundamental difference in the way we build our models to do the data analysis. So all these factors are taken into account if you use a random effects model. Now, increasingly, a lot of epidemiologists have tended to use random effects for a good reason, simply because it tends to give you a much wider confidence intervals, which means you're being extremely critical about your own data. and you're not giving any scope within the permissive range for people to come back and say, look, I think because you used a fixed effect model with a narrow confidence interval, you ended up with a signal for benefit which didn't quite exist before. I don't know how many of you are aware of the ezetimibe story. Ezetimibe is one of the agents which has been now recently advocated for as an add-on to statin therapy for more intensive control of cholesterol levels. Now, if you have read the papers on ezetimibe, if you look at the confidence intervals, it almost nearly touches the null association line. And one would wonder, if you use a different statistical model, would that hit the null line, and therefore would that have made any difference to the way people have interpreted the study findings? I mean, that's open to question. What is meta-regression? Now, meta-regression is generally something that people tend to employ in the context of literature-based meta-analysis as a source or a potential tool to explore the heterogeneity between studies. Now, one of the most important assumptions here is that the log odds ratio is related in a linear manner to one of the study covariates. So I'll give you an example here. This is the subgroup analyses that we performed for the aspirin paper that I just mentioned about. Now, if you look at these opportunistic groups of within individual studies. So we talked about the effect of aspirin on non-fatal myocardial infarction, total cardiovascular events, and non-trivial bleeds, which is a definition that we concocted. And we said, okay, what's the difference, or what's the difference in the risk if you were to classify studies before or after the publication date of year 2000, if studies had included more than 5,000 participants or less than 5,000 participants, and so on and so forth. And then we come to the dose of the aspirin. Now, one thing that you can see is, in terms of the data itself, all of these are called categorical variables, wherein it's either 1 or 2, or yes or no, or this or that. But if you're dealing with continuous variables, for example, if you're dealing with continuous variables like, for example, LDL cholesterol or HDL cholesterol, what we can do is model that continuous variable, or the mean of that particular study, to the log odds ratio of the outcome that we're interested in. And that's when we can use the example of meta-regression to use that. Publication bias is something which most of the reviewers are interested in nowadays if you're dealing with literature-based meta-analysis. So I would strongly encourage you to consider this upfront when you plan to do a meta-analysis of RCT data, of published RCT data. And lastly, just a brief mention about what is called network meta-analysis. So there's the fundamental theme about a network or an indirect treatment meta-analysis is that normally the way most randomized controlled trials are traditionally designed is to look at the effect of treatment A versus placebo on a given disease outcome, or treatment B versus placebo on disease outcomes. Now, what if I actually want to study I want to compare head to head the effect of treatment A versus treatment B on the disease outcome? That's fundamentally the principle of a network meta-analysis. So we try to build a statistical network of multiple randomized controlled trials wherein the common outcome was studied or common outcome was measured, but different interventions were used, generally against a placebo, but we want to get some indirect comparison between the molecules themselves. The classic example that I can cite in cardiovascular literature is the NOACs story, where there were no head-to-head trials between most of the NOACs for individual clinical outcomes. But fortunately, due to a meta-analysis, a network meta-analysis, which was conducted very robustly and led by Professor Kam, this led to the almost demonstration of the efficacy and perhaps widespread utility of these molecules in the context of CVD prevention. I think I would probably stop here and take any questions that you might have.